I never thought I'd be here, wanted by cops, chased down alleys, clutching stolen shoes like my life depended on it. And yet, there I was. It started simple, as these things always do. Mason had called me a few weeks back, his voice slick with whatever confidence scam artists are born with. "Levon," he'd said, stretching my name like a salesman closing a deal. "I got an opportunity for us. Nothing big, just a quick in and out, easy money." I didn't need the money, I needed the idea of it. Bills were piling up on the counter in my grandmother's kitchen, her shaky hands trying to hide the past due notices every time I walked in. She thought I didn't notice. I noticed everything. So I said yes. Just one job, I told myself. That's all it'd be. The night of the job, Mason picked me up in his rusted-out car. It smelled like mildew and bad decisions. He was grinning, his teeth too white against the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "Relax," he said, slapping my shoulder. "You're not even the one doing the hard part. All you gotta do is grab the stuff and run." He didn't need to tell me twice. Running was the only thing I'd ever been good at. High school track, neighborhood sprints, I was always the fastest. But that night, the running didn't feel the same. The store was dark, save for the faint glow of a backroom light. Mason had scoped the place, said the clerk left at 9 p.m. sharp. He wasn't wrong. Breaking the lock was easy, too easy. I felt my stomach twist as we stepped inside, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the cheap carpeting. "Grab the blues," Mason whispered. I didn't know what he was talking about until I saw them, the sneakers with the blue patches, limited edition, worth more on the street than I'd make in a year working legit. I stuffed as many as I could into the bag, my heart pounding like it wanted to escape my chest. And then it happened, the sound of a car door slamming outside. "Cops," Mason hissed, grabbing my arm. He didn't have to say it twice. We bolted out the back, the duffel bag slung over my shoulder like some ridiculous trophy. I don't know if you've ever run for your life, but it's different than running for fun. Your lungs burn hotter, your legs feel heavier, and every shadow becomes a threat. I could hear the shouts behind me, the flashlights cutting through the rain like searchlights. I didn't look back, not once. I knew the streets better than anyone. I ducked through alleyways, vaulted fences, and slid across slick asphalt, the bag bumping against my back with every stride. By the time I lost them, I was crouched behind a dumpster, my chest heaving, rain mixing with sweat on my face. Mason was gone. Of course he was gone. When I finally made it back to my grandmother's house, I was soaked and shivering. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes narrowing. "You been out with that boy again?" she asked, her voice sharp. I couldn't lie to her. Not about Mason. "Grandma, it's not what you think," I said, dropping the bag onto the floor. "I'm just trying to help." She didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she spoke. "Help me?" she said, her voice trembling. "By stealing? You think that's gonna help? That boy's gonna get you killed, Levon." I didn't have an answer for her. 2 days later, I met Coach Warren. He'd been the track coach at my old high school back when life was simpler. He found me at the community center, where I'd been trying to lay low. "You're wasting your talent," he said, sitting across from me on the cracked bleachers. "You could be running for medals, not running from cops." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But life doesn't hand out second chances like candy. "What's the catch?" I asked, crossing my arms. "No catch," he said. "Just a shot. Come run with my team. Stay out of trouble. You've got potential, Levon. Don't throw it away." The next week was a blur of conflicting emotions. Mason showed up again, dangling another opportunity in front of me. "Bigger payout," he said. "Less risk." But something in his eyes told me otherwise. And then there was Coach Warren, offering me a way out, a chance to leave the streets behind. I didn't know what to do, until Mason pushed too far. Mason wasn't the kind of guy to take no for an answer. The day after Coach Warren's offer, he found me outside an old laundromat I'd been using as my hideout. I was trying to clear my head, but Mason had other plans. "Levon, you're killing me," he said, leaning casually against the wall, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His grin was sharp, but his eyes betrayed him. There was a new desperation in them, something I hadn't seen before. "You've been dodging my calls. What, you think you're too good for this now?" I didn't answer. He didn't like that. "Listen," he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping. "This ain't like the shoe job. This is real money, enough to get you and your grandma out of that dump." "Real money sounds like real risk," I said, crossing my arms. "I'm not interested." Mason's grin faded. "You think you got options? That coach of yours can't save you. He doesn't know you like I do. You're a runner, Levon. That's all you've ever been." He wasn't wrong, but I wasn't about to let him drag me back into the gutter. "Leave me alone, Mason," I said, pushing past him. "I'm done." That night, I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the eviction notice on the counter. My grandma was asleep in the next room, her soft snores a reminder of everything I was fighting for. I wanted to believe in Coach Warren's vision for me, but the reality was crushing. Dreams didn't pay the rent. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. Mason, again. This time, the text was short and direct. "Last chance. Meet me at the lot midnight." I tossed the phone aside, but the message burned in my mind. I could ignore him, stay on the straight and narrow, but what if he was right? What if this was my only way out? At p.m., I found myself walking toward the empty lot. The night was cold, the air sharp with the promise of rain. Mason was waiting, leaning against his car, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He grinned when he saw me. "I knew you'd come," he said. "You're not as different as you think." "This is the last time," I said, my voice flat. "After this, we're done." Mason chuckled. "Sure, Levon, whatever you say." He laid out the plan, but something about it didn't sit right. The target was a guy in the neighborhood, a dealer who Mason claimed was sitting on a pile of cash. "Easy pickings," he said. But the way he avoided my eyes told me there was more to it. We moved fast, slipping through the shadows toward the dealer's place. Mason was cocky, too cocky, and when things went sideways, I wasn't surprised. The dealer wasn't alone. A scuffle broke out, shouts echoing through the alley as Mason pulled a gun I didn't know he had. "What are you doing?" I hissed, backing away. "Shut up and grab the bag," he snapped, his voice trembling. That was the moment I realized I was in over my head. I turned to run, but the dealer's backup was already closing in. Mason fired a shot, and everything went to chaos. The sound of the gunshot rang in my ears as I bolted down the alley. My legs moved on instinct, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Behind me, Mason was shouting, but his words were drowned out by the wail of approaching sirens. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the neighborhood, my lungs burning, my mind racing. I'd left Mason behind, but the weight of what had happened clung to me. This wasn't just a petty theft anymore. This was life and death. The next morning, I woke to find Coach Warren waiting on the front porch. My grandma had let him in, and she was sitting beside him, her expression a mix of worry and hope. "Leavin'," Warren said, standing as I stepped outside. "We need to talk." I braced myself for a lecture, but instead, he just looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know what you've gotten yourself into," he said, "but I see a kid who's better than this. You've got a chance to make something of yourself. But you have to want it." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. But something about his words struck a chord in me. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into training. Warren was relentless, pushing me harder than I'd ever been pushed. The team was skeptical of me at first, especially Aaron, the star runner who didn't hide his disdain. "You don't belong here," he sneered one afternoon after practice. "You're just a street kid trying to play athlete." But I didn't let it get to me. For the first time in my life, I had a goal, a real tangible goal, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. On the day of the big meet, Mason showed up at the track. I saw him leaning against the chain-link fence, his grin as smug as ever. My heart sank. I'd been trying to leave that life behind, but Mason wasn't about to let me go so easily. After the race, he cornered me in the parking lot. "You think you're better than me now?" He spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You think running for some washed-up coach is going to save you?" "I'm done with you, Mason," I said, my voice steady. "You can't control me anymore." Mason laughed, pulling something from his pocket. My stomach turned as I saw the glint of a gun. "What's it gonna be, Levon?" he said. "You gonna rat me out, or you gonna remember where you came from?" The sound of sirens filled the air again, but this time, I wasn't running away. I stood my ground, my hands clenched into fists. Mason's world was crumbling, and I wasn't about to let him take me down with him. When the cops arrived, I told them everything. Mason's schemes, the heist, the gunshot in the alley. For the first time in my life, I chose to face the consequences head on. In the months that followed, things started to change. Mason was behind bars, and I was finally free of his shadow. The track team became my family, and with Warren's guidance, I began to see a future for myself. I'll never forget the day I crossed the finish line at regionals, my team cheering as I shattered the record. It wasn't just a victory, it was redemption. As I stood on the podium, the medal heavy around my neck, I thought about the road that had brought me here. The choices I'd made, the mistakes I'd owned up to, and the people who had believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. The world doesn't decide who you are, that's up to you. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally running toward something worth chasing. New challenges. The aftermath of Mason's arrest brought unexpected changes. The neighborhood buzzed with rumors. Some painted me as a hero who stood up to Mason's reign of terror, others as a rat who'd sold out his closest ally. The truth was more complicated. Mason and I had never been true friends. He was a shadow cast over my life, a constant reminder of what I could become if I didn't make better choices. Coach Warren kept me busy, his training regimen more grueling than ever. Early mornings on the track, evenings spent studying race footage, and late-night talks about discipline and focus. But the biggest challenge wasn't the training. It was proving to myself and my team that I belonged. Aaron, the team's star, made sure I felt like an outsider. "You're not cut out for this," he said one afternoon, tossing his gear into his bag. "People like you don't last in a place like this. You'll quit when it gets tough." I didn't respond. Words wouldn't convince him. Only actions would. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the sport. Each lap on the track was a step further away from my old life, every drop of sweat a reminder that I was capable of more. Warren noticed the change, and slowly, so did the team. Even Aaron began to begrudgingly acknowledge my efforts. "You're faster than I thought," he admitted one day after practice, though his tone was still laced with skepticism. "But speed isn't everything. Let's see how you handle pressure." Pressure was something I knew intimately. It had shaped my entire life. But the track was different. Here, I was in control. The pressure was mine to manage, mine to conquer. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the track in golden light, I noticed someone standing near the edge of the field. My grandmother. She'd never come to watch me practice before, always insisting that she didn't want to be a distraction. But there she was, leaning on her cane, her face a mix of pride and worry. "Grandma," I called, jogging over. "What are you doing here?" She smiled, her eyes softening. "I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Warren keeps telling me you're going to be a star." I laughed, though her presence made my chest tighten. "He says a lot of things." "Well, he's not wrong," she said. Then, after a pause, "I'm proud of you, Levon. But I'm scared too. This world has a way of pulling good people down. Promise me you'll keep your head on straight." I nodded, the weight of her words settling over me. "I promise." The day of the first big meet arrived with an air of tension so thick you could almost see it. Teams from all over the state gathered at the stadium, their athletes stretching and warming up under the watchful eyes of their coaches. The crowd was a cacophony of voices, the stands filled with spectators and scouts. For me, the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about winning a race. It was about proving I belonged, about justifying all the sacrifices my grandmother had made for me. Aaron was running the first leg of the 4x400 relay, and I was anchoring, the final leg, the one that could make or break the race. It was a decision Warren had made reluctantly, but he believed in my speed. Now it was my turn to believe in myself. As the race began, the roar of the crowd faded into the background. My focus narrowed to the track, the rhythmic pounding of feet and the baton in Aaron's hand as he rounded the final curve of his leg. When he handed it off to me, I took off like my life depended on it. The race was going perfectly, until it wasn't. As I approached the final 100 meters, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure near the edge of the track, Mason. He was out on bail, his presence like a shadow looming over my moment of triumph. For a split second, my focus faltered. My stride broke. The runner behind me gained ground, his footsteps thundering closer. But then I heard Warren's voice, sharp and commanding from the sidelines. "Don't look back, Levon. Finish strong." His words snapped me back into the moment. I pushed harder, my legs burning as I surged forward. The finish line loomed ahead, and I crossed it just before my rival, collapsing onto the track as the crowd erupted in cheers. After the race, Mason approached me in the parking lot, his grin as predatory as ever. "Nice run," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "But don't think I've forgotten about you turning me in." "I didn't do it for you," I said, my voice steady. "I did it for me." Mason's grin faded, replaced by a look of cold anger. "You think you're better than me now? You think running in circles makes you a hero?" "I don't think I'm better than you," I said. "I know I am." For the first time, Mason had no comeback. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding. Not from fear, but from the realization that I'd finally taken control of my life. The victory at the meet wasn't just a win for the team, it was a turning point for me. Scouts began to take notice, and Warren started talking about scholarships, about college, about a future I'd never dared to dream of. My grandmother beamed with pride, her worries easing as she saw me thrive. But the road wasn't easy. There were still whispers about my past, still moments of doubt. And Mason's shadow lingered, a reminder of the life I'd left behind. The final chapter of this story would culminate in the biggest meet of my life, a national competition that would determine my future. But more than that, it would be a race against my own demons, a chance to prove once and for all that I wasn't running away anymore. I was running toward something. The rising stakes after that race, the weight of expectations grew heavier. My name was starting to circulate among the scouts, and Warren pushed me harder than ever. Every practice was a test of my resolve, every meet another chance to prove I deserved this second chance. But with every step forward, the past seemed to pull harder at my heels. Mason didn't just disappear. His presence was like a storm cloud that wouldn't go away. Every time I turned a corner in the neighborhood, I half expected to see him leaning against a wall, that smug grin daring me to forget where I came from. The team, too, wasn't fully convinced. Aaron, especially, kept his distance. He wasn't outright hostile anymore, but the tension lingered. I could see it in the way he watched me during practice, his jaw clenched every time I beat him in a sprint. The pressure came to a head one cold evening during practice. Warren had set up a grueling series of intervals, pushing us to our limits. My legs felt like lead, my chest burning with every breath. I stumbled during the last lap, falling to my knees on the track. Aaron was the first to speak. "See? He's not cut out for this," he said, tossing his towel onto the bench. "He's just a street kid playing athlete." I looked up, my anger flaring. "You think you're better than me?" I shot back, my voice shaking. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Aaron said, stepping closer. "You're a liability. You're just here because Warren felt sorry for you." "Enough." Warren's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He stepped between us, his gaze stern. "Aaron, hit the showers, now." Aaron didn't argue, but the look he gave me before he walked away was one I wouldn't forget. Warren knelt beside me, his voice softer now. "Don't let him get to you, Levin. You're better than that." I nodded, but the doubt lingered. Could I really escape my past? Or was Aaron right? Was I just playing a role I didn't belong in? The next morning, I woke to the sound of my grandmother humming in the kitchen. The smell of coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of rain from the open window. She smiled when she saw me, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "Big day today," she said, setting a plate of toast in front of me. "Coach Warren said the scouts from Summit University will be at the meet." I nodded, my stomach twisting with nerves. Summit wasn't just any school. It was one of the best track programs in the country. The idea of running for them felt like a distant dream, something meant for kids with cleaner records and bigger bank accounts. "Don't overthink it," Grandma said, as if reading my mind. "Just run like you always do." The stadium buzzed with energy as athletes warmed up on the track. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue. I could feel the eyes of the scouts on me, their clipboards ready to record every step, every stride. Warren pulled me aside just before the race. "This is it, Levin," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You've worked for this. Now show them what you're made of." I nodded, my heart pounding. The race wasn't just about winning, it was about proving that I deserved to be here. When the starting gun fired, everything else faded away. The world narrowed to the sound of my footsteps, the rhythm of my breathing, and the stretch of track ahead. I pushed harder than I ever had before, my legs screaming in protest as I surged forward. I crossed the finish line in first place, the cheers of the crowd washing over me like a wave. Warren was the first to reach me, his grin wide as he clapped me on the back. "You did it," he said. "They're going to remember that." But before I could fully bask in the victory, I saw someone standing near the edge of the track. Mason. Again. This time, he wasn't alone. Two men stood beside him, their expressions cold and calculating. Mason gave me a nod, a silent message that sent a chill down my spine. I knew what it meant. He wasn't done with me. That night, Mason showed up at my grandmother's house. I heard his voice before I saw him, low and insistent as he argued with her on the porch. "You think you can just leave me behind?" he was saying when I opened the door. "You think you're better than me now? Get off my porch, Mason," I said, stepping outside. "You've got no business here." He turned to me, his eyes blazing. "You owe me, Levon. Don't forget who helped you when no one else would." "I don't owe you anything," I said, my voice steady. "You made your choices, and I made mine." For a moment I thought he might lash out, but then he laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the night. "Fine," he said, stepping back. "But don't think this is over." The next morning, I woke up with a new determination. The national meet was only weeks away, and I wasn't going to let Mason or anyone else derail me. Warren noticed the change in me during practice, his encouragement pushing me further than ever. The day of the meet arrived, and the stakes had never been higher. This was my chance to not only secure a future for myself, but to leave the past behind once and for all. When the race began, I ran like my life depended on it. Every step was a declaration, every stride a defiance of the odds that had been stacked against me. When I crossed the finish line, breaking the record, the roar of the crowd was deafening. That race marked the start of a new chapter. Summit University offered me a scholarship, and Warren's pride was evident as he helped me navigate the next steps. My grandmother cried when she heard the news, her relief palpable. As for Mason, I never saw him again. I heard rumors that he'd left town, his grip on the neighborhood finally broken. It was a reminder of what could have been, but also of how far I'd come. Standing on the podium at the national championships, the medal heavy around my neck, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known before. The world didn't define me. My past didn't define me. I had chosen a different path, and for the first time, I felt like I was truly free. The day after the national meet, I found myself back on familiar streets. Port Ember hadn't changed, though I felt like a different person entirely. I didn't come here to stay, just to tie up loose ends. My scholarship to Summit University was secure, and my grandmother was safe and cared for. But one part of my past still lingered, unresolved. Mason. I didn't have to look for him. He found me first, standing at the edge of an abandoned basketball court, his once confident swagger now tinged with desperation. The two men who had shadowed him before were gone. This time he was alone. "Levon," he called, his voice carrying across the empty court. "You running back to your little team, or are you here to settle this?" I took a deep breath, stepping into the open. "There's nothing to settle, Mason. I'm done. You should be too." He laughed, but it was hollow. "Done? You think leaving this place erases everything? You don't get to walk away clean." "This isn't about me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's about you. You're still trying to drag people down instead of climbing out yourself." He reached into his jacket, and for a split second, I thought it was a gun. But when he pulled out an old photograph, I froze. It was a picture of us as kids, young, hopeful, before the streets had shaped us into who we became. "You were supposed to be my brother," he said, his voice cracking. "We were supposed to make it out together." I didn't know what to say. The Mason in that picture was a stranger to me now. But I understood the weight of his words. He wasn't just angry at me, he was angry at himself for falling so far. "You still can, Mason," I said softly, "but you have to want it." For the first time, he didn't argue. He just stood there, clutching the photo, his head bowed. I turned and walked away, leaving him to decide his own fate. The bus ride to Summit University felt like stepping into a new world. The city skyline faded into the distance, replaced by open roads and endless possibilities. I thought about everything I was leaving behind, the pain, the mistakes, the people who had shaped me, but I didn't feel regret. I felt hope. When I arrived on campus, Coach Warren was waiting, his grin as wide as ever. "Ready to start the next chapter?" he asked. I nodded, more than ever. Months later, standing on the starting line at the collegiate championships, I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. The crowd was a blur, the noise a distant hum. All that mattered was the track and the race ahead. When the gun fired, I ran, not from fear, not from my past, but toward a future I'd built with my own 2 feet. Every stride was a testament to the choices I'd made, the people who had believed in me, and the strength I'd found within myself. As I crossed the finish line, breaking yet another record, I realized something. Redemption isn't a destination, it's a journey. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just running, I was flying. Years later, as I stood on the podium at the World Championships, the gold medal heavy around my neck, I looked into the crowd and saw my grandmother. Her smile was brighter than the lights of the stadium, her pride, a beacon that guided me through every dark moment. Mason never left Port Ember. I heard he turned his life around eventually, though we never spoke again. Some stories don't end with a reunion, and that's okay. My story wasn't about escaping the past, it was about creating a future, and as I stood there, the anthem playing, the crowd cheering, I knew I'd done just that. The world doesn't define you. Your past doesn't define you. The only thing that matters is what you do next. And me, I was just getting started.